Okay, we'll now begin our third session of this week's newly elected officials training. This session is budget process in cities and towns for local elected officials. Our speaker this morning is Pat Walker. Pat has more than 40 years of experience in local government and municipal finance. She was with the city of Chandler for 23 years and served as the city's management services director and chief financial officer. At the city, she was responsible for all financial management, which included both external and internal audits. And in 2007, she became a municipal management and financial consultant to cities, towns, and utilities across the country. In 2012, she formed Pat Walker Consulting, LLC, to continue her consulting in municipal management and financial services to small and large communities throughout Arizona. Pat works with many of your cities and towns and is a great resource to municipalities in Arizona. We really rely on Pat for financial and budgeting advice. Pat Walker with us. Pat, welcome.
Thank you, Matt. Good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about the overall municipal budget basics, and what we want to achieve today, we go on to the next slide, is to really talk about the purpose of budgeting and the roles of budgeting. And the roles can be from what you do as council members to staff to the citizens. We'll also talk about the components of a budget and what makes it up, the development of a budget process, the revenues, the expenditures, and then we'll go into the adoption, implementation of the budget. We'll touch on how to read your budget, and then open it up for questions and discussions. So overall, the purpose of budgeting is really to meet an organization's overall strategic goals. And those strategic goals are set by council. And it's the duty and the responsibility of the organization to try to meet those goals, because what you're setting as goals are what your citizens want. So the budget is a process to determine what and how services will be delivered to the citizens. And then how are we going to finance those services? What money are we going to use? Where's it going to come from? How are we going to do this? And what level of services are we going to deliver? It's also an internal control mechanism for planning and controlling operations. Just like your own personal budget, if you don't know how much money you have coming in and plan on what you need to spend, whether it be a car payment or house payment, whatever, it's really kind of hard to control what you're spending. So just like your own personal, a city has to set a budget in order to be able to have an internal control mechanism for all the departments to know how much money they have to spend. It's probably one of the most important activities that is undertaken by governments. And thankfully, in the state of Arizona, revenues must equal expenditures. Unlike the federal government, where they can go into deficit, the state of Arizona says you must adopt a balanced budget. On the surface, it sounds very simplistic, because the bottom line is you can add revenues, reduce expenditures, or do a combination of both, but you have to have a balanced budget. So as I just said, it's a simplistic version. On what basis shall it be decided to allocate X dollars to activity A versus activity B? And again, that sounds really easy. Oh, we just have to decide. Well, when that activity A is whether or not to add police officers, and activity B is whether or not to add firefighters, and you only have a limited amount of resources or money available, it becomes very hard. And I'd say that's one of the hardest parts of being the council, is that if you had unlimited funds, it'd be easy. Everybody'd be happy. But unfortunately, that's not the case, especially now with COVID-19 and the economy that we're facing. Even though it's very positive, and we'll talk more about that as we get into the presentation, because I know that's something that's on everybody's minds. So the roles in budgeting. As I mentioned, there's really three roles in budgeting. There's the citizens, the elected officials, and public employees. And as you can see, I put the citizens first, because they're the ones that elect the officials and tell them what services they desire and what are their concerns, what are their needs to be served. And then the public employees are the ones that have to implement this. So the role of the citizen is to give a voice to the priorities of the service levels and the cost of providing deserved priorities and service levels. Many communities have what we call budget workshops or budget sessions or surveys to get that information. It could be that the council members talk to the citizens. It could be that these are discussed all year long, so there should be no surprises at budget time as to what you're looking at as far as service level delivery. And it all depends on what's going on too. If there's an increase in crime, you probably will see more of a demand to have more police officers, better response time. If there's if the amount of time to get to a call on an EMS call for firefighters is increasing, that might be it. It may be there are streets that need to be repaired, and you'll hear about that. It may be that people want more parks, more amenities. A whole bunch of things could come up, but these are what the citizens should be voicing to the elected officials on what they desire. The elected officials, again, is to set policy guidelines, establish what are the priorities, and communicate this to the constituents, and try to resolve conflicts, because there will be conflicts. If you only have so much money, you're going to have conflicts, because somebody's going to be disappointed. And I put on here policy guidelines because it's not your job to go in and create every line item in the budget, but it's your job to tell the staff, the managers and the staff, this is where I would like to see this go. What kind of policies are we going to set to follow in our budget process? The public employees, well, you have the department staff, and they develop the program objectives, identify service levels, and prepare budget requests. And this is really important because they're the ones closest to it. They know you hire people in the city or town to be able to provide the services, and they know what it takes in order to provide those services and at what level. So in other words, if you go to the police chief and you want to have a response time of 4 minutes or less, then he's going to tell you, or she's going to tell you, that it's going to take X amount of officers, or we're going to have to change up the beats or something, but they will know what they need. It depends on what level of service you want. And the executive management then is to prepare a recommended balanced budget, which incorporates the elected officials' priorities and looking at service levels and communicating what the service levels will be based on the proposed budget. So it is the responsibility of the town manager or city manager to give a recommended budget to the council. It's the responsibility of council to adopt the budget. So a lot of times in these sessions, we're asked, well, what's the difference between large communities and small cities and towns versus large cities and towns? And actually, there are some things that are different, but it's more on a magnitude, a scale of magnitude. More revenues coming in, more expenditures going out, but some of the premise behind budgeting is the same. As far as roles for citizens and elected officials, doesn't matter if it's a small town or large town. Citizens are going to have service level demands that they want, projects that they want to see done. And it's just, again, the amount that you're able to afford to do. The only difference with department staff is that in the smaller cities and towns, it may be that the town manager wears numerous hats and is the finance person and works with the departments or does the budget itself. Where in the larger cities and towns, you might have budget liaisons in each of the departments that work with the finance staff that then work with the city manager and all the department directors. But again, it's just the amount of staff that you need. So let's talk about building a budget. One thing that I think everyone has perception of is, oh, well, we're done with the budget. No, actually, you're never done with the budget. You start out with preparation, and you're going to be seeing that. You're probably already seeing it because of the COVID-19, that everybody is really monitoring their budget a lot closer than they probably ever have, simply because of not knowing for sure what's going to happen to the revenues, to the sales tax, to the gas tax, that sort of thing. So preparation can start anytime. Now, November, you're only into the fiscal year, 5 months. So it's kind of hard to know exactly where you're going to end up, but you're getting closer to be able to do clear year-end projections at this point. When you get to January, February, even closer. The closer you get to year end, the more precise your estimates can be. And that's why you update them constantly as you go through the budget process. Once you prepare it, then you take it to council for adoption. And this could be, and there are state laws regarding this on what you have to do, publishing, that we'll talk about later in the presentation. But a lot of steps have to occur before the council adopts the budget. And then after it's adopted, you have to implement it. As you implement it, then you put it into place, you have to evaluate it and monitor it. And this is where I was talking about, it's up to departments to make sure that they follow their budget. We know things come up, and we'll talk about contingency reserves and emergency type things, but you try to set a budget that everyone can follow, and you monitor it during the course of the year. Then once you get done with your fiscal year, which your fiscal year is July 1 through June 30th, so you end your fiscal year June 30th. One of the things that everybody thinks is, oh, well, we can start the audit right away. Well, no, you have to be able to record any accounts payable that come in July and August that were for invoices that were really for the prior fiscal year. You have to code those. You then have to look at the revenues that are received that were for the prior fiscal year and book those. So there's a lot of steps in July and August that have to take place. And then usually you start your audit process in the fall. And then guess what? You start all over again with the budget preparation. So the components of a budget, and this is just overall, this could be for any organization. It might change slightly from year to year, depending on the community, whether it's a growing community, whether it's not growing. And this is usually the division of the revenues by sources. You've got your taxes, which could include anything from local sales tax to franchise taxes. You have your current services and charges. This could be building permit fees. This could be park fees, police report fees, a lot of different type pool fees and charges for services. Intergovernmental, this is the state shared revenues, like the state shared sales tax, income tax, vehicle license tax. And then you have different miscellaneous monies and properties, license and permits, fines and forfeitures. You have a little miscellaneous here where interest income could come into there. And then your other financing sources in this community that was used for an example, this is a community that has a lot of capital. And it may be that maybe they're not a growing community, but they're an older community that have a lot of replacement needs, infrastructure and facility repairs and replacement. And so they have a large portion of their budget that's other financing sources, meaning that that could be bonds, could be loans, excise tax bonds, WIFA, that sort of thing. On the expenditure side, again, looking at what the breakdown is of what type of expenditures that's normally in a budget is personnel. And in this case, this is very small on personnel. Usually personnel makes up the majority of your budget because we are a service industry. I would say anywhere from 60 to 70% normally. In this case, they have a very small personnel. So I try to give examples of small cities and towns versus larger ones and where the money goes. Operating supplies, you can see, is a portion. Capital outlay now, again, is a bigger portion, as well as debt service, which is the amount of principal and interest that you pay on bonds. So we have different funds, and in the state of Arizona, there's actually only 2 funds that are required to be developed. One is the general fund. The other one is a special revenue fund called the Highway User Revenue Fund. There's also other funds that are created, again, getting back to the budget control and monitoring, such as the internal service funds and we'll talk a little bit more about that, capital projects, debt service, enterprise funds, and fiduciary funds. With the special revenue funds, some of the other ones are grant funds that could be there, excise tax funds, anything when it says special, that means it's used for a special purpose. So for example, the Highway User Revenue Fund, the only thing that can be used for is street projects. The County Excise Tax Fund, street projects. When you have internal service funds, that might be a fleet management department, an internal department that you have that serves the other. It could be information system department. Capital projects, you could set up different bond funds because you want to be able to track the bond proceeds coming in and what's spent. And then you have debt service funds to pay back those bonds. On enterprise funds, those are the water, sewer, sanitation, airport, golf course, and these are to be self-sufficient. That's the purpose of an enterprise fund, is to be used like a business. So in other words, the revenues that you generate cover the cost. One of the things that we'll be talking about is that enterprise funds are not set up to make a profit, but they are to cover their cost. And their cost can be everything from the operating expenditures to cover the debt service the debt service payments that you have if you have any outstanding bonds. And there's always usually a requirement of, well, if you've got a debt service payment, you have to have a reserve, and it's usually about 20% of the debt service payment on an annual basis. So you can cover that with your rates, you can cover your operating expenses, and you can cover a reserve, like a contingency reserve, with that. There's also something called indirect cost allocation, where you can pay the general fund for expenditures that they serve. So if you think about it, if you're a private business, you would have to hire someone to do your payroll. You would have to hire someone and pay them. You would have to hire someone to do your legal work. You would have to hire someone to do your HR work. Well, the general fund staff, the HR department, the legal department, all those departments that are serve the enterprise funds can be charged for those services. And then you have fiduciary funds, which are like the firemen, volunteer firemen pension funds, trust funds, that sort of thing. So the general fund is, like I say, it's revenues to be used for any municipal purpose. And it contains the most departments in the state, county, city, town budget, whatever. It's got the most departments in it. As I mentioned, special revenue funds are collected for a specific purpose. They're restricted in their use. The Highway User Revenue Fund is required by statute. And then, of course, there's grants. And grants are restricted too. If you get a grant and it's for specific use, you can't just use it on anything. You have to use it according to the grant agreement that you signed. And one of the grants that we're probably most familiar with right now is the Arizona CARES Act. And there's been a lot of confusion and discussion about the Arizona CARES Act, but the intent and what was said was that it would be used for public safety costs, to reimburse for public safety costs, which is police, fire, and not overtime, but in benefits. And so when the Arizona CARES Act reimbursed cities and towns for those costs, it freed up money in the general fund to be used for any purpose. And probably at the end, there might be some questions on that. So if anybody has any questions on that at the end, we'll circle back with that. But it is a grant. It's considered a grant through federal funds, and it went through the state. But it's got to be treated like a grant, and depending on your auditors, I will say it should be placed in a separate grant fund, and so you can track the revenue and the expenditure when you do the reporting. Internal service funds, as I mentioned, fleet management, risk management, information technology, and sometimes print copier funds. That's not so much anymore, as that's a little bit more old school with all our computers and everything. Capital budgets, it's also called CIP, Capital Improvement Plan. A capital improvement plan is something where you look at a dollar value of, say, a higher end, like for projects over 50,000, and have a life expectancy of 5 to 10 years. And you can look at, or I mean, more than 5 to 10 years, but you look at a plan for 5 to 10 years and has a life expectancy of at least 5 years. So things like, if you're going to build a new fire station, would be in a CIP. If you're going to build a new street, that would be in the CIP, those sorts of things. The longer you go out, the grayer the crystal ball gets. So that's why some communities only do 5, some like to do 10. But in any case, the reason you do it is because a lot of these projects require long-term financing through bonds. And depending on whether or not you're going to be selling bonds, there's a lot of different bonds that can be sold, whether it be general obligation bonds or excise tax bonds, but they have requirements that must be met. You can also do finance pay as you go. You can use grants, or as I mentioned, borrowing. And then the first year of the CIP becomes part of the annual budget. You adopt the first year of the CIP. Enterprise funds, I discussed that. It's like to be self-supporting. And again, on the state level, that's what universities are considered. So with the budget process, the very first thing you need to do is project out your revenues. If you don't know how much you're starting out with on revenues, it's kind of hard to budget your expenditures. So that's the very first thing you do. You say, how many revenues? If we're just looking at what we have collected to date, what are we going to take in, maybe what's new next year, and do some projections. you won't know how to budget your expenditures. One of the things on the expenses that is very important to do too is to look at what we call one-time versus ongoing. And it's also important on your revenues too. An example of a one-time revenue is like if you get a major construction in your city or town. For example, in Chandler, where I was, they had an Intel plant go in, and you can imagine the construction sales tax that the city got. But if they'd have turned around and hired a bunch of employees and gave raises and did things like that with that money, then it would really if you can hold on a second, I'm going to turn on the light here so everybody can see me pretty good. Hold on. Okay, so the one time, as I mentioned, is like a construction sales tax, and you don't want to spend that on ongoing expenses. Ongoing revenue is if, let's say, you added some more commercial to your tax base and you've got increased sales tax revenues coming in, well, then that's ongoing revenues that can be done. So one-time revenues are usually used for capital type expenditures. They're used to repair, replace, or build a new one, but they are one-time revenues. And then we have something that we call our fund balances. And what that is, and you're going to hear different terms using this, this is the amount that you have basically in your savings account. In other words, if you have your revenues coming in and you estimate your revenues and you subtract out your expenditures, if there's a balance, and hopefully there is, then that can be carried forward to the prior year and added to maybe any carry forward funds that you had carrying forward from years before. So that is what you call your fund balance. And that's part of the budget process, that you have to estimate that out so you know how much carry forward funds you have to be able to use maybe for either reserves or one-time expenditures. So let's talk a little bit more in detail about revenues. So again, this is just another chart showing another city or town and the breakdown that they had for revenues and the type of revenue sources. For local revenues, that can include sales taxes, franchise taxes, license permit fees, fines, and property taxes. On sales taxes, there are different categories of sales taxes. There's retail sales taxes, construction, as I just mentioned. There's utility sales tax, rental, and restaurant and bar, just some examples. Some cities have a lot more. Some cities have these, maybe not a lot more, but a few more, and different categories like use tax. There's a whole list. One of the things that I find very interesting to look at, even though I am a finance person, so that's probably why I find it interesting, but I think a lot of councils find this interesting, is if you go to the Municipal Tax Commission, Arizona Municipal Tax Commission, or Arizona Department of Revenue website, you can look up the tax rates for every county and community in the state of Arizona. And it's just interesting to see what the different rates are, what the different categories of rates are compared to your community. So that's something that a lot of councils ask for. Franchise taxes, well, what is this? Well, this is a tax that you can impose on like utility companies like APS or Southwest Gas for permission to use the city or town's right of way to put their underground lines. And this is something that must be approved by the vote of the people every 25 years. And it's usually based on a percentage of the gross sales. Property taxes. There's two types of property taxes in the state of Arizona. The first one is the primary tax, which can be used for any municipal purpose. Establishing a new primary property tax, if your community doesn't have one, requires a vote of the people. And I will tell you that that is a very, very hard thing to do, to get that passed. I've worked with a few communities that really put in a lot of hard work and effort to get that done, and just people are not very happy about property taxes. So it tends to get voted down. Not that it's not impossible to get it, but a lot of education has to go why you need it. You really have to be able to explain to the citizens why we need to impose this and what it's going to be used for. If you are going to have a primary property tax election, the only time you can do it is the third Tuesday in May. And then you have something called a secondary rate. And in the state of Arizona, the only thing that a secondary rate can be used for is the payment of debt service, as I mentioned, which is principal and interest on bonds approved by voters. And those are general obligation bonds. And if the voters approve the general obligation bonds, you can sell the bonds and impose a secondary tax rate, but only can be used for that. This is different from those of you that are from other states. I came from Illinois, and we were able to live on, as a city, we were able to live on property taxes as part of our operating. They weren't so much dependent on sales tax. They're more dependent on property taxes. These days, I think they're dependent on everything. I think they've got the taxes raised up on the sales tax as much as the property taxes, but property taxes are very high in the Midwest and on the East Coast, and even on the far West Coast too. State shared revenues, this would be your state sales tax, your income tax, your auto lieu, and your highway user tax. Your state sales tax, well, all of these are based on a formula, based on your population compared to the population of other cities and towns in Arizona. There's only one pie, and that pie is divided up based on that formula. So, and it's based on how fast somebody else is growing. You might grow in 1 year and not see an increase because somebody else is growing at a faster pace, and that pie is divided more towards them than it is to you. So again, this is the way the formula is set up, and now the population is looked at every year based on census estimates. On the income tax, this is from 2 years ago. And this is an important point that I'm seeing now as I work with many cities and towns on doing forecast, 5-year financial forecast, strategic financial forecasting. We know that the income tax we're getting this year is from 2 years ago. Well, what is the income tax going to look like after 2020? So in a couple years from now, we're going to feel the impact of what the unemployment had in 2020. And that's why that has to be taken into consideration when you're doing financial forecasting is, yeah, we might be okay in other areas, but that one might not come in as planned. On the auto lieu tax, that's when you go into MVD and pay your license, and this is based on the value of your vehicle. And so if the economy is good and people are buying cars, then you're going to see this revenue go up. If people are hanging on to their cars and not buying them, then this revenue is not going to go up. It might even go down because people are holding on to their cars longer, and then the tax is a little bit less. And again, it's based on a formula. Highway user revenue, this is what they call the gas tax. And the thing to remember about this is that it's not based on the price of the sale of gas, it's based on the number of gallons sold. And it's a pretty complex formula with, how much is sold within your county and how much is then distributed to your city within the county. But what I'm seeing, at least on the clients that I've been working with, is that we've been seeing a decline on this, especially on the border towns, because a lot of people would come over from Mexico and buy gas. And with the border closed, they're seeing some major dips in their highway user revenue. And that's one thing I do want to mention too, is that every community is different. Every community, you can't just say, oh, well, this is how we do revenue forecasting, and this is the way it should be for every community. Yeah, there is some models and strategic things that you can use, econometric models, regression analysis. I've used about every fancy one you can, but the best model you can have is knowing your community, know what impacts your community on revenues. Just like I mentioned with border towns, understanding the impact of that, understanding that if a community has one large employer and that employer is laying off, what impact will that have to the revenues of that city or town? We talked about other finance sources, and these are the things that are used for, as I mentioned, long-term capital items that, because you don't want to sell bonds and the asset only lasts a few years, and you have a 20-year bond or 30-year bond. So these are for long-term type projects that you have, or that are the assets will last a long time. One of the things that you can do is called general obligation bonds. And why a lot of people go out for these is that these have historically been the cheapest money that you can get on the market. Not so much anymore, but it was secured by the full faith and credit of the city. The thing is that in order to do this, you have to go out to the vote of the people and say, okay, here's what we're going to sell these general obligation bonds for. We're going to build a police substation, and or we're going to build these water lines and sewer lines, or we're going to repair these major water lines and sewer lines. But it has to be approved by the voters, and then you can go out and sell them. And then your secondary property tax is what is pledged to repay this. And why I say full faith and credit to the city is because you're basically saying, we will raise the tax rate to whatever it needs to be in order to pay these general obligation bonds. So it's a pretty secure investment for those people buying bonds. The revenue bonds, you see that in the water and sewer mainly. And you're pledging the revenues generated from the enterprise that you're talking about, whether it be water or sewer or sanitation. You're saying that whatever will raise the rates of these enterprise funds to pay back these bonds. Then you have to be able to show you have a certain amount of like I talked about, coverage ratio 20%. Usually it's higher with the revenues. They want to see it higher because guess what? COVID-19 hits, people aren't paying their bills on time, maybe in the utilities. They want to see that you've got some reserves there, that you have some backup revenues that are going to cover that in the event, or if you have a really rainy season and your water revenues don't come in as high. Those are the things that fluctuate difference on the revenue side, on the enterprise side. There used to be something called highway user revenue bonds. I don't see that very often anymore because of the fact that the coverage test that you have to do for that, and everybody is using their highway user funds just to maintain their streets and do street projects. So I haven't seen many of those. Those are more from the past that you saw those. You also have special improvement district bonds where a specific district is formed to say, okay, we're going to install sewer lines in this area, and all the property owners within that area is assessed to pay for that. You saw that a lot in the early growth years. We did in Chandler in the early growth years because of the fact that there were developments that wanted to occur where there just wasn't the utilities out there to provide the service. So we formed special improvement districts so that the developers could start developing more homes and businesses and that sort of thing. We also have municipal property corporation bonds, which is secured by an asset. And then the Water Infrastructure Financing Authority, WIFA, probably most of you have heard about that for water and sewer projects. So getting back to the preparation of a budget, as I mentioned, you first do the revenue forecasting and you want to produce a balanced budget. But one of the things that I always say that will catch up with you, and they're called phantom deficit reductions, is first unrealistic revenue projections. It's really easy to make everybody happy if you say, well, we got $1 million in requests. Okay, we got $1 million in revenue. Well, the problem with that is if you really don't think you're going to take $1 million in revenues, you got $1 million of expenditures there that somebody's going to get disappointed about because it can't happen. And a lot of times people get the budget mixed up with what are real revenues coming in. I can budget $1 million for revenue, but if I only take in $500,000 and I gave a department a budget, of $1 million, that's why I have to monitor. That's why we have to talk all the time as an organization about where we're at with these revenues, because you can't spend $1 million if you only brought in 500,000. So that's really important. And it's really hard sometimes because departments see that money sitting in their budget and they're like, well, I can spend that this year. You can if the revenues come in. And that's why it's important for departments as well as the finance staff to monitor those projections. And as we talked about before, one-time versus ongoing decisions or expenditures is very important in revenues. And then, ducking the decision. Hey, we'll solve this problem down the road. We won't raise rates right now. We'll solve it down the road. The problems that I've seen with communities that they can get into is that they have these debt service requirements where they say, okay, we're going to have a 20% reserve. They don't want to raise rates, but then the revenues don't come in and all of a sudden they're not meeting their reserve requirements. That can be a problem. Or maintenance gets deferred. And if you don't do repair and maintenance, sooner or later that will catch up with you. And then you're going to have major problems. You may have people that water main breaks. You may have a lot of infrastructure problems that maybe could have been prevented had you maybe looked at revenues, because there is always a solution. Council can choose to raise revenues. They may not want to, or the constituents may not want to, but that is a choice. What is given to you is, okay, this is what we know that we can do. Here's some alternatives. If you want to do more than we've recommended in the budget, you can do this. Now in Arizona, you are limited on what you can do. There are restrictions on what you can do. You can raise your sales tax rate up, but then as I mentioned, if you look at other communities and everybody bordering you is lower, that might be an issue. If you, on your property taxes, you're limited on your primary. If you do have a primary, you're limited to about 2% increase a year, not counting new growth, but you are limited. There is a ceiling on that. They give you a maximum allowable amount. And as I mentioned, our property taxes, the only one you can use for ongoing operations is your primary. So again, you're somewhat limited to what you can do on revenues. Now, of course, you can have fees, but the one thing about fees is that they are to cover the cost. They're not meant to make a profit. They're to cover the cost, because otherwise, if you're charging more in fees than what the cost is, then it's more of a tax, and that's where you can get into trouble. So you want to make sure that your fees are covering the cost. So what's council's role? Well, it's to understand the various revenue sources and their restrictions. I think that's important. You're not going to be doing revenue projections, but you should understand them. How were the estimates arrived at? Were there sound assumptions behind them? Does that make sense? If your finance director has gone up by $5 million from last year's budget, you need to ask why. What caused us to go up $5 million? Well, that's because we got this or this or this, or we got a windfall on this, we got the Arizona CARES Act, or whatever it was. There should be an explanation, and council needs to know, as well as the public needs to know that. So let's talk about expenditures. In the state of Arizona, there's something called the state expenditure limitation. And back in 79-80, the state of Arizona went and the legislation and said, okay, we're going to put into place a state expenditure limitation based on your 1979-80 revenues and develop an inflationary factor to add to that every year. Well, they quickly found out that that doesn't work so well for anybody that added new revenue sources from 79-80, such as system development fees or impact fees or something like that. And so they came up with some alternatives in 1981. And one of them is called the home rule election. And that's where you go to the vote of the people every 4 years, and you basically ask them to approve whatever your budget is becomes your expenditure limitation. And that gives local control to local communities to be able to budget what they need to provide services to the citizens. That's what the home rule is all about, to allow you to be able to do that. Now, the downside of that is you have to go out every 4 years. But for some communities, that makes sense because they're still growing. They're not sure exactly where they're going to end up. And so they don't want to do something, which is the next thing, which is called a permanent base adjustment. A permanent base adjustment is when you take your state expenditure limitation and you say, okay, let's say that state expenditure limitation is $1 million. Well, you do get an inflationary factor on that each year too, but I know over the next 5-10 years, I'm going to need another $2 million because I know I've got some things coming into the community that's going to really jump up our revenues. And therefore, I want to be able to add to our base and then get inflationary factor on top of that. So again, you go out to the voters, but you only have to go out the one time unless you down the road didn't estimate enough and you have to go back out for another permanent base adjustment. But again, that's calculated every year based on an inflationary factor. A one-time override, I'd say if you have to do this, there's probably a problem. Either there's an emergency that occurred, and the statute's very limited on what defines those emergencies and what you have to do in order to declare one of those emergencies and be able to exceed the expenditure limitation. But the other thing it is that if you lose the home rule election, you can't go back out and ask the people to approve it again for another 2 years. So in the meantime, if you know you can't stay under the state expenditure limitation, you can go out for what they call a one-time override. And what that is that you say, for this next fiscal year, we need to spend X amount of dollars over our state expenditure limitation. If the voters approve it, then you've got a year. Then you're going to have to turn around and do it another year until you can do your home rule election again. So that's the revenue side of the budget. And once you get all that formed and you say, okay, here's the money we have, now let's start preparing what our requests are going to be. One of the things that I keep emphasizing is council vision and goals. The staff is not there just to prepare a budget without taking that into consideration. They do. They need to hear that. They need to know where you see the community going. What are some of the things that you want to see your community do, again, under limited resources, but what are the things? And maybe this year, we just want to be able to provide the same service we did last year. That may be a challenge for some communities. It may be that we have to cut back. It may be that maybe we are doing better than what we thought and we can do some projects. Those are some of the things council can consider. So you have to look at your fiscal picture for the next year, your revenue projections and expenditure estimates. And then you have to work with the departments, and this is internal. This is what staff does, city manager, town manager, finance directors, and department heads. Usually the finance department puts out instructions and rules to follow in preparing your budget. And so one of the things is budget justification, because it's important that council understand why you need what you need. If you request a new position, well, why do you need it? What's that going to do to the service levels? Is that going to improve them? Is that just going to maintain them? And then you have to provide cost estimates. You have to be able to say how much it's going to cost to add that body with benefits, and what are some of the other supplies and things that are going to be needed associated with that new position. Or if it's like a program adjustment, gee, we need more money for utilities. Utility rates have gone up, and therefore we need an increase on our utility budget because we're not going to have enough next year because maybe APS or Southwest increased their rates. So that's why it's important to follow all these things and make sure that you're up to speed on what all the expenditures are going to be for the following year or increases. So let's take a moment to talk about the different types of budget processing. And there are different types, and really, I'll be honest, there's not probably one type that everybody uses. There may be a combination. The performance-based budgeting is looking at, okay, what kind of performance do we want? And what kind of service levels do we want? And we're going to build a budget so you can meet that performance. And then you have what you call program-based budgeting, where you look at specific programs like community and recreation programs, and you're going to look at what the total cost is to provide that program. One of the things that I found is very useful, especially when things are in a downturn, is to really know what things cost. So in other words, if your council says, well, how much does it cost to run the library? Well, if you've got a little bit of expenditure that's by a building and facility department for utilities, and you got a position in another department, this is where program budgeting comes in. You can put all these costs together and say, here's what it costs if we continue to keep our library open or our pool open or whatever the program is. And if we decide not to continue this service, how much money will we save? That is useful for that. And so sometimes people use it for some departments on program budgeting and maybe not others. Zero-based budgeting is something that sounds good on the surface. It sounds like, well, yeah, start from zero and everybody has to justify everything. Well, it's very labor intensive. And most cities and towns don't use it across the board for every department. They may use it for one department in 1 year, and maybe another department another year, just to do a check and make sure that you're just not adding budget on top of budget. And but there's some things that there's no control over, and utilities again is another good example. You can zero them out, but they're going to turn around and tell you, here's our utility bills, this is what it is. And and that's a good justification. But you can imagine of trying to zero out everything and tell every department, okay, justify every line item in your budget starting from zero. That's very difficult, especially unless you really start the year before. You can do a modified zero base and do a target base. Say we're only going to give you 80% of your budget, and then you're going to have to turn in justifications, or what they call decision packages, for the other 20%. So that in the event that we have to cut 20% of your budget, we have an idea of what might be harmed by only giving you 80%. There's incremental, which is probably the most used budget process. That's where you look at what they spent last year and maybe give a percentage of increase. I personally don't like just to give a certain percentages across the board, because what can happen is that there's some line items that doesn't need to be increased, and there's others that might need to be increased more, so it needs to be scrutinized a little bit more. Or there might be some that had a one-time adjustment that won't happen the following year, so you don't want to turn around and give it back in the budget again if it was a one-time payment that won't be coming up again. There's expenditure control budgeting, and what that is something that Chandler did years and years and years ago, and that is where, and they say that anything that you save in the budget you can keep. And I'll tell you, when we implemented that, it sounded really good and departments really liked it, but the bottom line is that with vacancy savings, some departments got really fat if they had a lot of turnover. So we said, okay, we modified it the following year and said, no, you can't do that. We're going to take the vacancy savings that goes into one pot like a reserve, and that's going to go towards like one-time type capital items. And the reason for that is because if you're going to keep the position, you only have 1 year vacancy savings, because if you fill the position, it's gone. So that's another budgeting process that's been used, and I think it's still used in Chandler, but it's scaled down version for where it was. On the line item, everybody uses that, because that's how you control and monitor your budget, is by line items. So you might have an incremental budgeting, but you're also going to break it down by line item. You might have a program budget, but break it down by line item. That's used in every budget. So what's council's role? And as I mentioned, the city or town manager is responsible for presenting a budget to council. I haven't been to a place yet where there's not more requests than resources. I've never had the problem of, gee, how do we spend our money? That just hasn't happened. You should align your expenses with council goals, and keep out of the weeds and look at policy level. And I always like to bring this up because it's very comfortable to just get into the line items and say, well, why did you spend $50 more on office supplies than you did last year? Why did you spend so much on this line item versus last year? And I think that the focus then gets lost by the council on what their job is as far as policy setting, about giving vision and goals so that a budget can be developed. It's not that you shouldn't be able to ask questions of staff on every line item, sure, but if you're focused more on the major differences from the prior year budget, that really kind of breaks down from, well, gee, how many pencils are you going to buy, or copy papers or something. So I think that it's really important to look at, if your payroll budget's gone up by a big percentage, and there's something should be presented to council. Well, that's because insurance has gone up by 15%, or it's because PSPRS rates have gone up, or we've given a 2% COLA in our estimates. Whatever it is, that should be briefed to council during the budget sessions. But then the council is to say, okay, is this meeting our goals? Is this really meeting the policies that we've set as a community in order to be able to deliver the services we need to do? And again, we want to approve a balanced budget. The only thing I will caution you of on a balanced budget is that it's getting back to what I said about a revenue budget versus revenue reality. You can have a balanced budget. You can say, I'm going to take in $1 million, I'm going to spend $1 million. Boom, I'm done. I've got a balanced budget. But that really may not be budget if you only take in 500,000 and you budgeted $1 million on expenses. So again, I'm just cautioning that terminology, and the state statute says it has to be a balanced budget, but I'm going one step further and saying, yeah, it needs to be balanced, but it needs to be a realistic budget. So what's the difference between large and small cities and towns on what we just talked about? Well, processes can be used by large or small communities. Doesn't matter. Those budget processes can be implemented either one. Small communities tend to get into line item. But again, as I mentioned, that kind of loses sight of the big picture. So what I try to do is give as much information on significant variances from one year to the next on the line items. Even if it says that it went up 100%, if it went to $50 to $100, I mean, that's not material in the scheme of things in your budget. So you can't just look at percentages. You need to look at, okay, what is a dollar amount to? And ask those kind of questions. And then you still have the same revenue sources, basically, just at different levels. They all have state shared revenues. They have local sales taxes. Some communities don't have primary property taxes. Some don't have secondary property taxes. But most communities have building permit fees, planning fees, park recreation fees, court fees, that sort of thing. On the expenditure side, I'd say in smaller towns, usually the departments are not as involved other than the manager talking to them and saying, hey, will this work? Is this going to be enough funds? Is there anything we're missing? Where in bigger cities, there's a real formal process where you fill out decision packages. You usually have a financial software budget system that you input into. And I've seen in smaller cities and towns, it's more of a manual process. With smaller cities, it can become more political, but not necessarily. There's always the vocal minority that can appear in larger cities that I've seen. So it really, the politics depends on your community. And of course, expenditures may not be of the same magnitude, but can be more than revenues than base allows. So everybody's facing the challenge of trying to create a realistic balanced budget. So let's talk a little bit about budgeting in Arizona, keeping it legal. And again, these are things that you as a council are not going to have to worry about unless somebody doesn't do their job in watching these. And usually the clerks are very good, town clerks, city clerks are very good at doing this, as well as your finance staff, on making sure they're following these guidelines. But a lot of times it's like, why are we having to do all this? Well, this is the reason why certain things happen during the budget process, is because of the requirements of the state statutes. So what are some of the budget issues that are impacting Arizona? Well, compensation is always an issue, especially when raises haven't been given for a while and employees are not happy or they're leaving. That's an issue. Growth related issues. Revenue reliance on leakage. In other words, how much are we losing to another community? There's competition, and it always seems like there's some unfunded mandates that you must meet. And how do you come up with funding for that? Industry, attraction, retention, water supply for some communities, regional transportation, and of course, community development or redevelopment, depending on the age of your community and where you're at. So I mentioned, as far as being legal in Arizona, you must adopt a balanced budget. The tentative budget must be adopted by the third Monday in July. And usually I would say most people need to have their tentative budget adopted by July 1, if possible, because your fiscal year starts July 1. So, I mean, there is communities that go into the before the third Monday in July and it's legal, but as a recommended best practice, I would say it'd be best to get your budget adopted before then. There is no requirements to, believe it or not, to have a final budget unless the city or town has a property tax, but most communities do adopt a final budget. A property tax must be adopted by the third Monday in August, but 14 days after final budget adoption. So that's why it's important to put out a budget calendar and look at, okay, when do we need to start reviewing the budget? When do we need to adopt our tentative budget? And you do have to still publish the Auditor General schedules into the newspaper for 2 consecutive weeks before you adopt your final budget and have your final budget hearing. And then after that, you have to put both on your website, the tentative budget and the final budget. And then, as I mentioned before, there's various restrictions on funds with HERF, with impact fees, that's development impact fees. You can only use it for specific purposes. on how you create the fee. And again, there's another whole statute on that. Tentative budget is required to be itemized per the Auditor General forms, and this is found on the Auditor General forms. This is what your finance staff will do, but you will see these. These will be distributed to council. They're on the website, and then again, they'll be published in at least Schedule A will be published in the newspaper, and all the forms will be on the website. And this details out your resources, whether it be fund balance forwards, the revenues that you're projecting for all the funds in the city or town, as well as the projections for the expenditures. And they added a few years ago few more schedules about personnel cost, on how many positions you have, what the salaries are versus retirement versus healthcare cost, benefits. And as I mentioned, it must be published once a week for 2 consecutive weeks, and you must publish the notice of the hearing for the final budget adoption, and both the tentative and the final must be published on the city's website 7 business days after adoption of the budget. And it must be posted for 60 months or 5 years on your website. Again, these are just more posting requirements. Again, things that you won't need to worry about as much as your staff does. But again, these are just posting requirements that your clerk, your finance staff, make sure these things are done. One of the statutes that is very important to know is what they call ARS 949915. And this is proposed municipal taxes and fees notification requirement and exception. So what they're saying is if there's a new or increased tax rate or fee, you have to post a written notice of the proposed increase on the homepage of the municipality's website at least 60 days before the date the proposed new rate is approved or disapproved by the governing body of the municipality. So again, you need to be able to notify people so that they have an opportunity to voice their concerns or approval of a new or an increased tax rate or fee. ARS 951101, again, water and wastewater rates. You must file a written report supporting the increase at least 30 days, but you do have to do a notice of intention at a regular council meeting at least 60 days before the public hearing date. They also have a requirement that you must publish notice of intention in local newspaper with public hearing date, time, and place no less than 20 days before the public hearing. And then after the public hearing, the council can adopt by resolution or ordinance fee or charge the increase, and then it becomes effective 30 days after the adoption of the resolution or the ordinance to increase the rates. So another thing that we have in our Arizona state statutes, which can be confusing, is truth in taxation. And the one thing about truth in taxation is that it's not about the rate, it's about the levy. And if your levy, if your assessed value goes up, you may be required to do notices and the requirements of what they call truth in taxation. So the reason for this is because you have to look at a citizen perspective. If you had a house that was valued at 100,000 last year, and now it's valued at 110,000 this year, and even if the tax rate stays the same, because your assessed value went up, your tax levy or bill will go up. So that's why they say if your levy's going up, that you have to do the truth in taxation notices. Now, and what I've seen more than I'd say in smaller cities and towns is that your levy has been going down. So you can raise your property tax rate up. Again, you have to do your 60-day notice that I just went over in 49915, but truth in taxation doesn't kick in because you're not raising the levy. You're just trying to raise the rate so you don't have a decrease in your property tax levy. So what kind of things do you need to go out for bonds? Do you need to go out for elections? General obligation bonds, yes. Revenue bonds, exception of utility for city towns under 50,000. And highway user bonds, yes. Municipal property tax corporation bonds, no. And one more thing on there I should have added is excise tax bonds, where you pledge excise taxes does not need to go out to the vote of the people. As I mentioned before, if you do an establishment of a primary property tax rate, yes, you do have to go out to the vote of the people. If you do a home rule, you have to go out every 4 years, permanent base adjustment, or a one-time override. So let's talk a little bit about issues facing small communities. And I do work with a lot of small communities, and one of the things that they battle is a decreasing tax base. That could be from the assessed value to sales tax base. So in other words, home values are not going up, or you're not building and home values are not going up. Sales tax base, you have businesses that close, or you're not adding anything else to it. These are all issues that communities are facing. And then again, you have limited revenue options with your sales tax, fees and charges, and property taxes. So it is a real struggle to try to figure that out. And gee, if we don't have any way to attract new businesses and our old businesses are closing up, what do we do? Well, you have to balance your budget. So you have to look at, well, what services do we have that maybe we can't do anymore? What are we going to have to cut back on in order to do that? And then you let your citizens know that. If we don't, since we have a decrease in sales tax, our assessed values are going down and our property taxes are going down, we can only raise fees and charges up to what the cost is to pay to provide that service. So the only alternative, as I mentioned at the very beginning, is you can increase revenues, decrease expenses, or do a combination of both. And that's what a lot of small communities are faced with. Other things are deteriorating infrastructure. I work with a lot of communities that have very old infrastructure and things break and they just don't have the funds in order to repair them. And so that's a real issue: streets, water, wastewater. And then there's a catch-22 with creating new jobs and attracting new businesses. As far as it's if you're going to create new jobs and attract new businesses, you better have good infrastructure in place. You need to be able to have quality of life. That's a really important thing. I know when Intel came to Chandler, that was one of the things on the top of their list when they were looking at other states to go to. And they were saying, what type of amenities does the state of Arizona provide for our employees? What kind of quality of life? And Chandler had a really good reputation of having a good quality of life offered as far as with parks and our center of the arts, and then able to get to Phoenix and all the sports teams and things like that. That all came into play. It wasn't just all about how much it was going to cost them. It was about what it brought to attract high level positions to work at Intel. And then again, services expected are above revenues received. I know a lot of times I'll say, well, okay, you don't have enough revenues to cover your budget. Well, let's close the pool. Oh, we can't close the pool. The pool is the only thing the community has. I get that. Well, then what about the library? Nope, we can't close the library. Okay, well, then we're going to have to cut back on police, which is usually the biggest cost in any of those. Well, no, we really have cut back. We only have so many officers. And well, then what coverage ratio do you want to have? Or how much do you want to cover in the city? Or what's your response times? Those are all real problems that small communities are facing. And I'll say, a lot of large communities are starting to face some of these things too, but I'm seeing it more and more in Arizona with the smaller communities. The other thing is that hiring qualified personnel, especially in remote areas, is sometimes hard to do. Growth is not always welcome either. People want to keep the size of the community the same, not realizing that sometimes then that means that the revenues aren't going to be there to provide the services. And they want to keep the identity, but can't afford to, but not being able to afford it. Resistance to regionalization of services. And what I'm talking there is that a while back, we tried to get a number of small cities and towns to come together and share police services, because it seemed like it was a lot of money for every city or every town to have its own police department. And why not try to combine those resources? But there is a resistance that, some communities say, well, we want our own police department. We don't want to share those services. So that's a real issue that they have to deal with. And as I said before, minority voice becomes majority. And also there's a deep culture, and culture is important to these cities and towns. And that's why I say every community is different. Every community has to be treated differently. It's not like a blanket across the board. Here's how we're going to do the budget process with all communities. So let's talk a little bit about large communities. Again, when the economy goes bad, as we saw, back in 2008, 2009, everybody suffered. Assessed valuations went down. All those communities that were dependent on growth and building new houses, all of a sudden it stopped, and they weren't selling houses anymore, and then they were being vacant, and then there was no water and sewer money coming in, and there was a lot of problems associated with that. And again, sales tax base. And then, as I mentioned before, there's limited revenue options that you can use in order to make up that difference. So what can communities do? Prevent deteriorating infrastructure by reinvesting with the one-time money that you do have and making sure that you stay on top of it. On large community, competition is high between communities. Just like small communities, sometimes growth is not always welcome, depending on the type of growth that you're talking about. And a lot of large cities want to keep community identity, but it's more expensive, like downtown redevelopment, sport complexes, things like that. And so again, it may be a little bit different problems, but there's still problems that they have to face. So with that, I'm ending early. I'm seeing that there's a lot of questions that are appearing on the screen. One of the things that I would like to mention that these are resources. We have the Government Finance Officers Association. And one of the things that I have gone into before in more detail is how to read a budget. And there is something called the Distinguished Budget Presentation Award. And a lot of small communities cannot afford to put this kind of document together, but some type of document that is easily readable for the citizens to understand what revenue sources you have, what you're spending your money on, what are some of the priorities of council going into the next fiscal year, what are our service levels, that sort of thing. And GFOA, Government Finance Officers Association, has a lot of good resources on that. On the Auditor General, they have a website that, and that's an old website number. I'll have to send out the new one. That's an old website number. I'll get that out. Either Matt or Tom can get that out to you guys too. But what they have is webinars, and they have a lot of information on their website about state of Arizona, the Auditor General forms, about the requirements of certifying every year who your chief financial officer is. There's a form that has to be filled out for that. There's a lot of requirements. One of the best things that I tell every new finance director to read when they first come on board, especially if they're not from Arizona, is the Budget and Finance Manual. And that is really a great document that goes through Arizona state law. And what I like about it is that they'll go through and explain it in layman's terms, and then they put the statute associated with it, and you can double click on the statute and go right to the statute and read the statute too. And it talks everything about the different revenue sources, the restrictions. It talks about the expenditure side. It's got about audits, investments, purchasing, procurement. It's really a good document. And I tell finance directors to read it, but I think also managers, council, it's a good document to go through and understand. It's very understandable. And then, of course, this is my email address. Anybody has any questions or any follow-up after the session, I'll be more than glad to help you out. So with Matt, I'll turn it back to you.
All right. Well, thanks, Pat. That's a lot of information, and but a lot of good information. And as you mentioned, we do have a number of questions. So we'll start at the top. So the first question is, can all the fire and police expenditures during COVID months be paid out of the CARES Act, freeing up general fund monies?
Well, how I'll answer that is that there was allocations that were given to each of the cities and towns. And so there is a cap. So in other words, if your city or town was allocated $500,000 in CARES money, you can request reimbursement up to the $500,000 for the cost of public safety salaries and benefits, not overtime, from March 1 of 2020 through December 30th of 2020. Well, that timeline's already gone. That had to be submitted by July 30th. And so most cities and towns, in fact, all of them, I think, from what I know, correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, have received the CARES Act. And now we're in the mode of having to show we did estimates, because everybody that requested the money was still in the budget process. So all you could do is give figures for March 1 through June 30th, but you had to do estimates from July 1 through December. And now they're asking for documentation, give us what your true expenditures are, because you have to be able to justify that you really did spend that money on that. And yes, then what happens is if you pay those expenditures out of the general fund, that frees up general fund money for other purposes. Unfortunately, and I want to caveat this, the other purpose is to make up the revenue shortfall that many communities are feeling with COVID-19. The good news is we got CARES Act money. It did free up money in the general fund. The bad news is that that's about as much money as we need to cover our losses for the year.
Right. And Tom did let me know that you're correct on that, Pat.
Okay.
Great. The next question is, once the budget has been adopted and implemented, can funds be moved from different projects if necessary, i.e. impact COVID-19 on approved and implemented budget?
The answer is yes, by council approval. The source that you need to use as being what you can and can't transfer beside the state statute, contingency reserves need council approval. But the budget adjustment, the budgets that you put on the auditor general forms on Schedule E is departmental budgets. So if I put a departmental budget of $1 million for the police department, you can move money around the police department all you want within the general fund. But if you want to take money from the police department and transfer it to the fire department, that takes council action. If you have a project that was appropriated for within a fund and you decide to do another project, you don't have to do a budget transfer for that within that fund. But for transparency purposes, if you're changing a project, I would say that would take council discussion, and a lot of communities do council action on that, simply because if you were going to build a park and now you decided to build something else, and say it's just general fund money, then you need to let people know that park won't be built.
Okay, thank you. And just to clarify, Tom said that all cities and towns have received their CARES funding, as you'd say.
Okay.
All right, the next question is, do revenues have to be balanced by fund or just by the budget overall?
Yes, they have to be balanced by fund. So in other words, you can get into big trouble if you don't do that. And I'll give you an example. Let's say you don't have enough revenues to cover your water fund, and you've got water expenditures of 2 million and revenues of 1 million. Well, where are you going to come up with that other million unless you do a balanced budget? You may have to do what we call a transfer. You know, some cities subsidize, which is not a really good idea, but because you're using general fund money to support a enterprise fund, but you would still appropriate an amount for transfers into that fund. So you technically, I would say you have to have a balanced budget just for monitoring purposes, but I have seen where you don't necessarily show the transfer in as appropriation on the auditor general forms, but you have to have a transfer in to balance the budget.
Great. Next question is a question on the use of fees. If the town does not have a primary property tax and is facing a large increase in the cost of public safety that the town cannot afford, can they impose a public safety fee with a vote of the people versus trying to push through a primary property tax to fund the public safety?
Tom and I have had many discussions about this, and I'm not an attorney and I don't want to weigh in on that. There has been a discussion, but it's my understanding that you can't impose a fee like that as a public safety fee. But Tom, I guess I'm going to ask you to weigh in on that one, because you know what I'm talking about on that law.
Pat, I didn't hear that last part.
There was a addition to 49915 that was put in about fees, and it grandfathered in one community, but I think you can't do a public safety fee.
Matt, is it okay if I go ahead?
Yes. Yeah, please do, Tom.
Okay. I just want to let folks know that most of the fees, whatever you do, that fee has to be based on something. Usually what they try to do with the fee for public safety is attach it to the size of the lot, or take a look at how big or how small the property is, and that is the the people who are against this at the legislature just see that as kind of an in lieu property tax. And so, yes, right now, there has not been a fee that has been creative enough to get passed, because right now we would have to go and get that authority from the state legislature. And there hasn't been a fee that's been creative enough for us to be able to get passed. So right now that doesn't exist, but maybe you can come up with something that's creative. If there's ideas that you would like to run past the staff, we're always willing to hear those, but it's going to be very difficult to get that through this legislature.
Okay, next question is, can a city use a one-time override if they have a PBA in place?
I'm not sure. PDA, what's that?
PBA?
What is that?
I don't know. Capital PBA.
It's a permanent base adjustment.
Ah, thanks, Tom. So can a city use a one-time override if they have a permanent base adjustment in place?
It would have to be according to the emergency of the that's defined in the statutes. And there are specific emergencies, whether it's governor declared, council declared. But they could do a one-time override for that, but they would have to follow the statutes regarding that. It'd have to be a major exception to do that.
Okay, the next question is, what happens at the end of the year if expenses exceed revenues?
I don't want to hear that. I hope that doesn't happen. You mean overall? Well, let's just hope you have fund balance. You can have your expenditures exceed your revenues, but let's hope you have your fund balance, because I don't know how you pay your bills then. If you have your expenditures exceed your revenues, you're out of business. So I don't see how you can have it within one fund, but then you're going to have to transfer money from another fund. And I'll be honest, some communities have gotten in trouble because they've used their HERF funds to pay for general fund expenditures, and that's a big no-no. And if you get audited, you'll have your HERF funds removed or stopped. Same with county excise taxes. So you do have to have enough revenues in the funds that you need to cover. So you can't use general fund, you can't use HERF money to cover general fund expenditures.
Okay, the next question, can you explain the limitations on special improvement district taxing? For example, can neighborhoods be asked to pay for their own street improvements?
If you form up a special district, an improvement district, you have to get, I think it's 51% of the homeowners. Again, I'm not 100% sure on that. I probably, if somebody wants to get with me afterwards, we can follow up on that. But you have to get the approval of the majority of the homeowners within that district to assess it. And so you lay out, and the same with a municipal property corporation type thing, or not community facility district. I'm sorry, community facility district, same thing. You don't see as many special improvement districts. You see a lot of community facility districts out in the West Valley and that sort of thing. But again, it has to go through a process of getting the homeowners to agree to it within a specific area.
Okay, the next question is, please explain the levy rate again. How often can a levy be increased on assessed values?
Well, the levy is really what is given to you based on the assessed values and your property tax rate. So in other words, they send you from the county assessor what the assessed value is of your city and town of residential and commercial property. And then they take, okay, well, what's the maximum amount that you can levy and not be in truth and taxation? What's the amount that you can levy and stay within the state statute? And they provide that every year. And like I say, it's a form, and I'm talking primary. That's a formula based on a 2%, no more than 2% increase plus growth. And so you can go up to 2% plus growth and be okay on your primary. On your secondary, it's just based on what your debt service payments are, your principal and interest, and that can go up to whatever your principal payment and interest payments are.
Okay. Next question, what if a service such as the ambulance is operating in a deficit?
Same thing, same answer. I think you need to reevaluate whether or not that's a service that you want to deliver as a city or town, if you're having to take money from the general fund to subsidize the ambulance. Again, that's some of the hard things we were talking about, decisions, A versus B. The more money you siphon off the general fund, the less you can provide in services for parks, pools, library, public safety, all those other things. And so it depends on how far your ambulance is bleeding. If it's taking a few $100,000 a year, is that really something you want to provide, or that should be private industry? Those are the kind of difficult decisions you have to make, but you have to fund it from somewhere.
What can I do? This is the next question. What can I do to stop the town from borrowing out of funds such as HERF to pay expenses?
Well, you may not have to do anything, because if the Auditor General hears about it, they'll be doing a performance audit, and they will make sure you don't. The thing that I found is the most difficult for small cities and towns is that all the money that comes into the town goes into one checking account. And I'm not suggesting you get a bunch of checking accounts. I'm just suggesting that you have a good financial software where you're tracking the HERF money and the excise tax money. Because let's think about it. Your money comes into the bank and people look at cash balances and they say, oh, wow, we got all this cash. Well, actually we don't. We got 50,000 from HERF this month. We got 10,000 from excise taxes. We got 100,000 from grants. Well, guess what? You can't spend that on general fund money, on general fund expenditures. But a lot of cities and towns do, because they see it in their checking account and they think, well, we have the money, so they're floating it. But technically, you're not supposed to do that. But where you really get caught is at the end of the year and your audit's done and it shows clearly that you borrowed money from HERF to pay for general fund expenditures. You're going to get an audit. And then what they're going to do is tell you what you need to do in order to pay that back. And I know it's paying from one pocket to the other. You're just paying yourself back, but it's a state statute that you're only supposed to spend it on street projects, period. Not on public safety, not on anything else. So then you've got this amount that you have to pay back. So all you can do is just make sure that, you're monitoring, you're controlling what, looking at the general ledger and making sure that you're spending your HERF money for street projects and not too short on your general fund side.
Okay, next question. Is there a statutory limit or cap on the amount or percentage of money that a city can carry forward each year?
No, there's not a cap. There's policies that can be developed on how much a city or town wants to carry forward, how much they want to put in reserve. I work with one town that has a policy that they want to always keep 3 million in reserve, not a contingency reserve, just, where they don't appropriate. It's just part of the fund balance that they set aside in the bank in the event there's a problem. And the difference between a contingency reserve and a fund balance is, like I say, you look at what you carried forward from the prior year, you add in revenue, subtract out expense. That is your fund balance. You may have $1 million in fund balance, but you may decide that I'm only going to appropriate 500,000 for contingency reserve to spend in the event that there's an emergency or a revenue shortfall. You've got appropriation there, because remember, you have to appropriate for everything you spend in Arizona. So if you don't have an appropriation, you can't spend it. So if there's an emergency you didn't plan on, a water main break, you want to have a contingency reserve appropriation you can go to and transfer that money to the line item. So there's no limit on how much fund balance you can bring forward.
Okay, next question. Does the city have to outsource paving streets a certain percentage? How much can be done by the city?
The city doesn't. I'm going to say I've never heard where there's a law or a statute that the city has to outsource any of the street projects if they don't want to. If they want to do it in-house, it's just cost prohibitive or there's not enough staff to do it. And so they use outsourcing to maintain their streets for that reason.
Pat, I'm sorry, let me jump in here. There is, and this is in the budget and finance manual, if those projects exceed a certain dollar amount, they have to go to a private contractor.
Is that under the procurement or is that under?
That's under procurement. That's in ARS Title 34.
Yeah, that I would agree. If you
Okay.
have it under procurement code for that, I would agree. But I don't think is it so much because of the dollar amount, or is it because it's a street project?
There's several infrastructure projects that are captured
Right.
in there, and so It depends on, there's 3 or 4 categories. And again, it's broken down. It was a really good suggestion you made for them to take a look at the budget and finance manual, because in there, it specifically talks about the amount that they can use and do the work in-house. And if they're over a certain amount, it has to go out to a private contractor.
Okay. Is this in compliance with Title 34 of the procurement statute? Tom, do
Yes.
you know? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So that's the other resource, is the Title 34 on that. Okay.
Correct. Correct.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, next question. If enterprise funds end up making money rather than breaking even, must those funds be used only for that enterprise fund, or can they be used for other things such as capital improvement projects?
If they're enterprise capital projects, yes, they can be used for enterprise capital projects. If the revenues are exceeding expenditures, that was the question, Matt?
Correct. Enterprise funds and the revenues are exceeding expenditures. They're making money. Can they then use those funds for, can it be only used for that enterprise fund, or can they be used for other things?
Well, it's kind of a mixed answer here. As I mentioned before, you can do indirect cost allocation, and a lot of communities don't do that. So in other words, if I ended up having more revenues than expenditures, then are you transferring money to general fund to pay back for those services that are provided to the enterprise funds, would be my first question. If the answer is no, then yeah, you can transfer that money as long as you can show the expenditures are there, do a cost allocation review and say, okay, we spend X amount of dollars in the general fund to support the enterprise fund, then those revenues can be. If your revenues are consistently exceeding your expenditures, you might want to look at that, because it could be that you build a lot of capacity and you're now getting in more people to pay to share in the cost of things, and so your revenues exceed your expenditures. But I can't believe that you shouldn't be building a reserve to do repair and replacement of that infrastructure for the future. More people are paying, sooner or later you're going to have to start doing repair and replacement, so there'll always be capital expenditures. But if the question is, can I use enterprise revenues to pay for general fund capital projects, I would say I don't know that there's anything that would stop you from doing that in Arizona law, but I think it could become a legal issue by ratepayers that you're using money that's supposed to go to water and sewer and using it for other purposes.
Okay. The next question says, please restate where I can obtain or print out the budget and finance manual. Now, this is on the league's website. So if you go to our website, which is in the links under the presentation AZ Government 101, we have a link to the league website. But just a note on that budget and finance manual is only for city and town employees or elected officials. So if you're not a city and town employee or elected official, you can't have access to that document. If you are, though, you can go to our website and request that document from the league. So again, you go to our website and go under publications, and you'll see under publications the budget and finance manual. Okay, the next question is, can you use a levee to build a water pipeline from an aquifer to meet safe yield?
A levy? You mean like a property tax levy?
That's what I would assume.
Well, if you have a secondary property tax, you can sell water and sewer general obligation bonds and levy the amount of principal and interest on those bonds to do whatever capital project you want, if that was the question.
I think it is, because it just says, can you use a levee to build a water pipeline? Yeah. Okay.
But you need the vote of the people to get the general obligation bond.
Point. Next question, does the contingency count towards your revenues for balanced budget purposes?
A contingency, again, the definition between fund balance and contingency. Fund balance is considered a revenue. It's the amount of money you carry forward. A contingency reserve is the amount of expenditure that you would have appropriated in the case of a revenue shortfall emergencies. So it would be considered an expenditure.
All right, and then the last question is, will we have access to downloading these videos from these trainings for future use? And the answer to that is yes. We are recording all of these newly elected officials sessions, and we're going to send these recordings out to all those who signed up. It will probably be next week sometime because we have to edit the videos, but these videos, then you'll have access to view them after the fact. And so those are all the questions we had, Pat, from the audience. And I would just end with a general question to you, Pat. You know, many times these newly elected official trainings, we say it's like drinking from a fire hose. It's a lot of information. And these newly elected officials that are just coming into office are coming in halfway through their fiscal year. So I would end with the question to you, Pat. What would you, if you had one kind of general piece of advice, let's say I'm a new council member, I'm just coming on council, and I'm overwhelmed with all the information that I have to learn, and I want to kind of understand the budget. What's one thing that I can do to, coming on council to best appraise myself of the budget or get familiar with it? What would you recommend to a newly elected official?
Well, I would go back to the budget and finance manual. I think that's something to be read, but then the next step would be to sit down after you get familiar with reading that, sit down with your manager and your finance person and walk through it with them to understand it. If you're trying to understand the budget process, have that manual in front of you and walk through it with them so they can explain it to you as to what your city or town does. And I think that's going to be the best way, because again, like I say, every community is different. Yeah, you have specific laws that you all have to follow, but how you approach the budget process can be quite different from community to community. So it's really understanding what your community has been doing in the past or what's planning to do in the future. And that would be through your city manager, town manager, and whoever the finance person is.
Great. All right, Pat. Well, thank you very much for taking the time and for imparting your knowledge. And as you can see on the screen, Pat has a number of resources there that are very helpful to both newly elected officials as well as staff in cities and towns. And Pat is a great resource for cities and towns. So thank you very much. Again, all of you who are still on, again, a reminder, we're going to be sending out the survey after all the sessions are done on Thursday. So please jot down your notes on things that you liked from this session, things we can improve upon for future use. And we will see everybody at 1 p.m. for the social media for elected officials session, the next session of the NEO. Thank you, everybody. Have a great morning. And thank you again, Pat. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.